It's Arjun, and I'm just back from 8 days on the road. So this is going to be a shorter video podcast that touches upon three key themes. First, pushbacks have gotten to our view that the total addressable market, the TAM for oil, is at least double current demand levels. Second, some perspectives on the NVIDIA-like moment that we're seeing in merchant power generation equities. And finally, a preview of what I think is next for what has become a controversial term, energy transition. So let me start with some of the pushbacks to our oil TAM could be double current demand. And the first pushback that I honestly find kind of the most shocking, perhaps disappointing, is the one that the developing world can't have developed world living standards. And I've said this many times. This specific feedback is not coming necessarily from the environmental community. They may share those views, but I've long said if you're an environmental activist or an NGO, this is your job to fight and defend the environment. The world needs environmentalists. Where I get this comment from is at times from those in the business community focused on new energy technologies, executives of those types of companies, as well as people who purport to be earth scientists. I really struggle with the idea that a private equity company executive or other new energy technology company, or folks that, again, say they're scientists one way or the other, are going to make the comment, and I've gotten it directly. This is a near direct quote, that the developing world can't have developed world living standards. How could I possibly assume it? I think the good news is that myself, as an American energy equity analyst, these folks I get the feedback from who generally are American or European executives, or again, I'm going to put scientists in quotes. It's not going to be up to us. I can have my opinion. You can have your opinion, at least for the 4 billion people in Asia, China, India, rest of Southeast Asia. They for sure are on the track of self-determination. And all of our analysis focuses on what I think is actually going to happen and then what might be the risk reward to that. This idea that they can't have developed world living standards, I don't know what to say about it. I think when it especially comes to scientists, whatever happened to having a questioning attitude, but I think we've already made that speech once. The other pushback we still do get, though it's from a dying group, is the sort of hockey stick EV adoption and fuel economy growth forecast. And let me just flip through a few quick slides on those points, because it's worth remembering. The EV hockey stick, this is from as recently as 2021, just 3 years ago. There was a thought by a non-trivial number of people that by 2030 to 2040, nearly 100%, or certainly the vast majority of vehicle sales would be EVs. And all I have to say is we are not on track. We're not even remotely on track for these types of forecasts. EVs are going to grow. They're going to be part of the geopolitical security mix for countries with large oil imports, a la China is usually my example. I think India is going to try as well. If you told me in some future decade, I don't know if it's 30 years, 40 years, 50 years from now, can EVs be 50% of the market? Yeah. But again, let's remember, EVs are about a quarter of the oil demand barrel. And this total addressable market for especially the developing world is massive. So they will chip away at some of that sort of unabated oil TAM, if you will. But 75, 90%, 100%, I will take the under, and I will take the way under from a criticals minerals, from a resource development standpoint, from an affordability standpoint, from all the metrics. We're going to have a mix of vehicles on the road. There will be an effort to diversify. Those hockey sticks are nowhere near on track to happen. I think the other area that I've spent a lot of time on, and this has started throughout my career, well before this sort of focus on climate and CO2. This has always been a question, this assumption that just because the government mandates a certain fuel economy improvement, it is not necessarily going to be achieved. So this is actually historic data. For the last 23 years, there is a negligible improvement in actual fuel economy, and it's certainly well below that which was implied by corporate average fuel economy standards. This is the US. This is true for most of the rest of the world, with the exceptions of Europe, to its credit, as well as Japan. For most of the rest of the world, massive disappointments. And why? Why has this happened? It's not just test to real world driving. That is part of it. The biggest issue has been vehicle weight. And I have to ask the question, if you are someone who's most passionate about the climate, why is there not focus on vehicle weight? Why do you give that up? Why the focus on EV SUVs, which are even heavier than ICE SUVs, that are going to require substantial amounts of critical minerals and mining resources, which we know is a challenge and I think has its own environmental impacts. Why is there not focus on vehicle weight if you really did want these metrics to improve? Don't ban ICE vehicles. Ban SUVs if you want to do something. And I always hear, well, that's too politically hard. That's politically harder than banning ICE vehicles? It's perplexing. It's a huge area of opportunity for folks who actually want to improve fuel economy. Why there's not more focus on vehicle weight is a mystery to me. You put it all together. When you look at oil demand, this to me is going to be one of our North Stars. Are we on track at any point in time for either continued growth or a plateau or someday a decline in oil demand? Very simply, you can think of oil demand as GDP growth multiplied by the number of barrels to generate $1 of GDP. And that barrels to generate $1 of GDP, we use fewer barrels every year. That's your inherent efficiency gain, if you will. It's the combination of any substitution, things like electric vehicles or renewable diesel, sustainable aviation fuel, as well as that fuel economy piece, miles per gallon or kilometers per liter. And I've shown this before. The black line is oil demand. It's essentially positive in every year. Essentially, GDP growth, inherent economic growth, has overwhelmed the efficiency gains we do have. And at the barest of minimums, to simply plateau oil demand, you're going to have a ratcheting up of both substitution and fuel economy so that it at least matches the inherent GDP impact. To then get declines in oil demand, of course, you're going to have a further acceleration. You just look at the red bars. To plateau demand, you'd have to be at this dotted line. To have negative demand structurally, you'd have to be at this dashed line. We are nowhere near that. We're not even remotely on track for it. Why this belief that somehow by 2030 or 2028 or even 2035, even oil companies have 2035. Why do we think any sort of plateau, let alone peak and decline, is happening anytime soon? Let's watch this. It's going to be our North Star. So I'd like to shift to the second big topic, which is real oil and gas equities have the merchant power generation equity moment. Look at this stock chart. This is over the last 1 year. This is NVIDIA, which is the yellow line, versus Vistra, Constellation, and Talon. 3 merchant power generators have done about as well, and Vistra has actually beaten NVIDIA. This is the white line's the S&P 500, which hasn't exactly performed poorly, but you can barely see it as a blip. And so, what happened here? What allowed for this kind of rocket ship performance? I think just a few things to keep in mind. I think we can wonder when or if this will at some point happen to traditional oil and gas companies, both upstream, midstream, downstream, the whole sector there. I think the first was going into the last couple of years, there's been a growing question of, with the greater amount of intermittency of intermittent resources, solar and wind in our electric grid, and with the retirement of baseload coal in particular, and lack of growth in natural gas in recent years, is there going to be a need for more power generation demand? And so you were set up with the question of, hey, maybe things will be a little bit better going forward. I think the second big thing that, of course, happened is the AI boom. And it has made it unquestionably, people have flipped to where it's unquestioning now that power demand is going to grow. And that's really been the move up here, where big tech has, I think, catalyzed the recognition that with AI, we're going to have pretty meaningful power demand growth. There's going to be electrification, electric vehicles, and all these things. I think that's really been the inflection. You were set up for it, and then that was your real catalyst. And it's not a huge space, the merchant energy space. There are only a handful of names you can really pick from. These are, I don't know them super well. I think some of these are generally thought of as well-run, well-managed type companies, but they were poised to take off. Look at the S&P 500 in the energy sector. Given the recent M&A activity, you're down to 21 names that comprise your 4% S&P weight. It's not going to take much. It's going to take some notion of structural demand growth, some catalyst. And I do wonder if or when we can have, I'm going to call it a merchant power moment for traditional oil and gas equities. It's hard to know the timing. I do think what you've seen here is pretty interesting. The last topic I wanted to talk about today is what has become the controversial term of energy transition. And of course, there's some of you who say you should not be using that term, Arjun. It's just like ESG and sustainability and energy transition. These are now progressive terms. The philosophies that underpin them are completely wrong, and you should not promote the use of this term. There's also still some of you who say, absolutely, we're energy transitioning. And yes, maybe it's a little bumpier, or maybe it's a messy transition, as you yourself, Arjun, have characterized it, but that is still the right term. I think there's no question that it is going away. Its traditional definition, which over the last 3 years, I think, has meant we're going to move out of traditional energy and into new energies. That definition is going away. These terms don't really bother me. I have no issues with energy transition, sustainability, or ESG. I have a huge problem with the progressive interpretation of these terms and their taking over of their meanings and the policies that they support as a result of their ideology. That I share the pushback on. I do think there's a need for non-progressive voices, moderates as well as conservatives, to engage on these topics, perhaps create different terms, but to not just be anti-ESG, anti-sustainability, and anti-energy transition. I do not view that as any more the answer than the progressive versions of these terms. To me, what energy transition is going to mean, or some future term, how are you going to meet the world's energy needs? All of them, all 8, at some point, 10 billion people on Earth, not just the lucky 1 billion, but the other 7 to 9. How are we meeting their energy needs? And when we think about geopolitical security and affordability and reliability, we won't just be doing traditional energy. We will be doing new energy. And that, to me, is what these terms are going to mean, whatever the heck we want to call it. I think big tech is going to lead the charge here. I think that's a good thing. They're generally popular. They're huge portions of the market. They don't have the taint's not the right word, but whatever baggage still weighs upon, quote, big oil and legacy energy. I think big tech is still generally viewed as a more favorable, or society likes them, kind of sector. And they're going to lead the way. AI power needs, that's a buzzword or an excuse. It is going to make them realize that their net zero promises were never on track to be met, and certainly aren't now. And power is going to be the core driver. And I think they're going to figure out, how do we meet our energy needs? How do we think about trying to do it in a lower emission way going forward? But the energy has to be there first and foremost. It has to be reliable. It has to be for citizens and consumers. It's going to have to be affordable. It may not have to be affordable for big tech and industrial companies. I think they're going to lead the charge, and I think that's going to be a good thing. I think this is our salvation from what has been a messy energy transition to one that's going to be a healthier evolution going forward. Geopolitical security, I've said this a few times now, it's going to be a huge motivator of new technology development. It is the reason, for example, why China is moving to electric vehicles. There's no way it's for the climate. You'd rather have a coal-fired EV if you're a Chinese government or consumer than an OPEC plus, Russia, Saudi, or US shale Canada fired ICE vehicles. That's not a close call. That's going to be true of India. It's going to be true of any region that is generally short crude oil or traditional resources. I think the final point is that 2021 post-COVID rush, that you have to transition in fast, or you're not doing right by society, and you're going to be a bad person and a bad company if you don't transition fast. That ideological mindset is going away, and it's going away hard, because the math never made sense. This presumed certainty that you can scale new technologies quickly was never accurate. From lab to pilot to full-scale development for something like green hydrogen, for even electric vehicles, which are a relatively more mature technology, it was never going to be as easy and painless as the true believers would have had you have suggested. And I think for companies that got grief for not transitioning faster, you should be applauded. That's a huge portion of the traditional American and Canadian energy space. Good job sticking to your guns. The economics were not penciling out. It wasn't your area of expertise, and you took a lot of grief for it. And I think you're going to be better positioned to help the world meet its energy needs. The world's going to need a whole bunch of natural gas. So if you're a natural gas producer, thank goodness you stuck to it through some deep cyclicality as well. And the world's still going to need the oil that is produced from the US and Canada. It has met 90% of net global oil supply growth over the last decade. Thank goodness for it. And thank goodness you stuck to your guns. Not everybody did. Some companies in other parts of the world tried to transition faster to varying degrees of success or more likely lack of success. Mostly American and Canadian companies stuck to their knitting. And I think they should be proud. I think they should be proud that they are well positioned to help the world meet its energy needs. So I'd like to end this video on a personal note. It is 2024, but here in the New York area, it feels a lot like 1994. That was the last year both the Knicks and the Rangers made the finals. It was the Rangers' last Stanley Cup. And at least over the last 30 years, the Rangers have had some competitive teams. They've had some good playoff runs. They played the LA Kings in the finals. I want to say that was 7 or 8 years ago. They weren't going to win that, and they didn't. But it hasn't been a complete disaster like it has been for the Knicks. So the Knicks, of course, lost that heartbreaking finals that they should have won. Some unfortunate shooting performance from John Starks, Olajuwon, Sam Cassell. That team, they won it. And some of you are Houston Rockets fans, I know. So congratulations. We had a few good playoff years after that. But if you're a Knicks fan, it has been an unmitigated disaster for certainly all of the 2000s and 2010s. And we had a mellow team that never felt sustainable and maybe one other playoff team. It's awesome seeing the Knicks today. They're unlikely, if they do make it past the Pacers, we'll see. They're unlikely, I think, to beat the Celtics. But you have a nucleus, you have a coach, we have Jalen Brunson, we have a hardworking, give their heart every game, every minute. Play 48 minutes if you have to, play 53 if there's overtime if you have to. That's Josh Hart. It's really the greatest Knicks team in my lifetime since I was too young to remember the Clyde Frazier team. So please, I hope you'll all think well. The Rangers, let's hope, do not blow this 3-0 lead to Carolina. Game 6 is about to start here as I'm recording this. And we'll see you. We're going to take Memorial Day as a holiday, and we will see you in 2 weeks. Thank you.